I would like to introduce our speaker for this evening. His name is Andrew Glencross, and he is a graduate of Cambridge University, where he earned a BA degree in political science as well as a master's in historical studies. And then in 2007, he completed his Ph.D. in political science at the European University Institute in Florence, which is a very nice place. So I was going to ask him about that after the speech. You might talk to him about that. He's a former Joseph Hodges Choate Fellow at Harvard University, and since 2008, he has been a lecturer in the International Relations Program at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the author of What Makes the EU Viable? European Integration in the Light of Antebellum US Experience. I'm teaching a course on federalism this semester, and so it seemed very appropriate to ask him. I read his book and asked him to come and make this presentation. He has taught classes in European integration, American government, international relations theory, and the history of political theory. His primary research interest concerns European integration, and especially the problems of negotiating state sovereignty and democracy in the EU as compared with the United States. So please welcome Dr. Glencross.
Good evening. Thank you for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. This actually afforded me the first opportunity to take a car in this great country, my first road trip, or American road trip, I have to say. That was great coming from Philly. It was great. And it's great to see a turnout as strong as this as well for a topic which is not perhaps one of the most glamorous ones out there. But I want to try and make it as engaging as possible, because what I want to do today basically is take you through some of the constitutional issues facing the European Union today. I've heard a lot say in the last 10 years about the difficulties the EU has faced when it comes to adopting a formal constitutional document. But I want to expand the scope from just a question of whether or not it has or needs a written constitutional document. So we're talking about the kind of constitutional issues it faces, how serious they are, how they might be resolved. So the title of my talk, and the first part, which is this kind of funny British colloquialism, I should add, if anything that I say sounds a bit funny as well, please pick me up on that, because I want to try and make sure that I communicate despite my funny accent, yeah? So the first part of this title will become more apparent as I take you through this in a few moments. But overall then the question is, why the EU faces constitutional problems, and why it faces constitutional problems particularly that it finds difficult to resolve in a democratic fashion. So that's the nature of what I'm talking about today. As a result, my talk has got a threefold purpose basically. The first element is descriptive. I don't imagine you're EU experts. This is a seriously abstruse, difficult to understand subject, even for those, and I think I know a few of you here who've taken courses on European integration. It's still a real minefield of complexity for myself as well. I really need to keep asking people who know more about this subject, particularly lawyers, to always remind me about what's going on. It's a moving target as well. So I want to have a descriptive element to really explain the constitutional issues facing the European Union today. And in particular, I think a way of trying to understand those issues in a better perspective is to have a historical and comparative perspective on those issues. In particular, by invoking a comparison then with similar constitutional issues that arose in the course of American and Swiss political development. You'll notice in the title, I basically tried to use as a ploy the American analogy. I didn't mention anything about Switzerland, which is this kind of much more dull, small, insignificant country, yeah? But I'm going to be talking about Switzerland as well in this case, about what kind of examples and similarities we see in terms of the constitutional issues it faced. Thirdly, I want to end with a more projective element. That is a question of discussing the kind of lessons that I think need to be learned when you're trying to actually look at how the EU might solve the various constitutional quandaries it's faced with today. That's the kind of projective final element I'll get around to. To situate my argument, first of all, though, I want to take you through, basically, the way in which the EU increasingly resembles a federal state. So I want to give you a kind of checklist of various federal features of the European Union. Start you off with this important element, a typical federal element then, which is the fact that European law, European treaties have priority over national law, even national constitutional law. Yeah? Clear federal structure. If there's a clash between these two, the EU element will prevail. In tandem with that, there's also this important feature in the European Union, which is the fact that EU law creates rights for citizens to use against their own countries. That is, if a country doesn't respect EU law, EU treaty provisions, those citizens in that country can sue their own governments according to European law, European treaty requirements. So it's a bit like, say, in the 20th century here in the US, the incorporation of the Bill of Rights, originally intended to be rights against the federal government. Now you can use that within a state against your state if it contravenes your federal rights. That's a key federal element that also exists in the EU today. Third thing to know, which is a kind of federal element again, is this powerful institution which is the European Parliament. It's a really powerful legislature, represents citizens directly across the whole continent. And political scientists who are keen to label these kind of things, they would classify it as basically the second most powerful legislature, that is, law-making institution in the world. Any guesses for which one would be the first? Yeah, it's Congress. The idea is that in comparison with most national parliaments in Europe, which are controlled by parties that also control national executives, therefore turning them into kind of rubber stamping mechanisms, the European Parliament is a very important law-making institution in its own right, federal institution in that sense. Fourthly, you've also got this thing called the European Court of Justice. That's basically the equivalent of the Supreme Court that adjudicates clashes, conflicts between EU law on the one hand, national law. And member states defer to that to resolve those questions. It's an accepted part and parcel of the constitutional apparatus. So again, very federalist. Finally, you also need to bear in mind the fact that EU policies now really are vast and all-encompassing. Whereas originally they more or less dealt with technical features of regulating what was originally a market, a common market basically, now those powers are much more expansive. They even include some powers of wealth redistribution, although there is an independent tax-raising power there. So that in some countries, for instance, up to 70% of national law is basically a transposition of European law into that member state's national legal apparatus. As a result, then, the EU has features, basically, of a quasi-federal system. But at the same time, therefore, it also faces the kind of particular problems associated with federalism. Constitutional problems associated with federalism. I want to mention three in particular that I'm going to be talking about in the course of my presentation tonight. The first problem is this idea, how do you establish a vertical separation of powers? That is, where do competences lie between, on the one hand, the European Union, and on the other hand, the member states? Well, that's a question of what we would say is vertical separation of powers. Second constitutional issue concerns horizontal separation of powers. What powers do the different EU-level institutions have? EU is basically fundamentally divided into an executive, the European Commission, a sort of Senate, the European Council of Ministers, which represents the member state governments, and then this European Parliament. So the horizontal separation of powers is a question of what powers each of those different institutions has vis-a-vis the others. That's a typical federal problem. Thirdly, finally, in terms of these constitutional problems, you've got the whole issue of what's the actual role, the proper role for the judiciary here. Judiciary is obviously important because federal systems are highly legalized. They're much more legalized, say, than unitary systems. And as a result, politics needs to think about what kind of legitimate role jurisprudence has and how politics can respond to that. And I'll be talking about that again later on. So what's distinctive then about the EU is not the fact that it faces these kind of constitutional problems. What's distinctive, I would say, is the fact that it struggles to solve those problems separation of powers problems in particular in a democratic fashion.